Alright, it's time to get on to the mapping part of this, the texturing part of this tutorial. A couple things to note here. You may notice the torch looks a little bit different. That's because I did some tweaking on it afterwards, just polished it up a bit, made it look a little bit more like what I was going for. So the torch will look slightly different from when we last left off. If you want to do a comparison, just go ahead and feel free to check back to the previous video and check it out now. There's just a couple of minor things. I won't go into it all, but it just looks a little bit more polished up now. And the second thing here is that I do this task twice. I do it first, and then I do it again while recording, just to speed things up and make things more efficient. And while I was doing the modeling for this, the mapping, I realized that this is an extraordinarily complicated object to map for some stupid reason, and I actually don't have time to go over figuring out how to break it up. So what I did was, instead, I did that ahead of time, and we'll go to that in a moment. And what I'll do instead is I'm going to use a much simpler object, and that'll be a cube, to just go over the basics of UV mapping. So what is UV mapping? Well, basically, you have this 3D object, and you need a way to put a flat texture onto it, a way to tell the program, how do I want to wrap this texture around the object? And the easiest way to think of it is, imagine if you were to have a flat piece of paper. How would you draw areas to cut on the paper so that you could fold it into the shape you want? So I'm going to use a cube for this, because it's easily one of the simplest objects out there, and it should illustrate things pretty well. So to go to UV mapping, you're going to right click on your object in face selection mode, or I think possibly, body selection mode will work as well. And you are going to left click on UV mapping. And there's several ways to do this. The first thing I like to do is move the window into the side here. Now there's several ways to do this. You can, for example, just choose segment by and projection or feature detection, and it'll automatically create segmenting for you. It'll create all the cuts and lines and faces and all that fun stuff. Or projection, which will project from the camera view. And both of those can be useful at times, but I almost always prefer to just do it manually. And the reason being that you just have a lot more control over it, and it'll look exactly the way you want. So what I'm going to do, is I'm going to start all over again. I'm not sure if it's actually done any of that yet, because I didn't continue forward. But just in case, I'm going to right click on it. And this is going to erase everything and start over. So now we're back to a blank slate if we weren't already before. And so the way I like to do it is I like to select edges and mark for cut. So you have to look at your object and you ask yourself, if I were to cut this into a way that I could lay it down on a flat piece of paper, how would I do it? And there's a couple of different ways you could do it. So you could just select all the edges and mark them for cut. And then if I continue and I go by unfolding, I'm left with a whole bunch of squares. And that's one way of doing it. And actually, to be honest, for this cube idea, I suppose that would work. But for a lot of objects, you don't want to break it down into each face and just kind of slap them on. It's just not going to look nice. You're not going to be able to make sense of what's going on. And even here, if you were to cut each one of these squares, you now have to tape them all back together. Ideally, you don't want to have to do that. You want to be able to just fold it up. So once again, we're going to scrap that. Now let me point out something really quick here. This little ABCD texture, this is just to kind of give you an idea of how your texture wraps around the object, how it warps, and if this looks funny, it means your texture will look funny too. And one thing I will point out is that since we did choose to cut each face separately, None of these textures line up very well. They're all, if this was a texture of, say, a rock or a piece of wood or something, you'd be able to tell in a lot of cases where the seams are, where the different faces are. So it's time to start over. Right click on UV mapping, and we're back to square one. So this time, when I'm going to select the edges, I'm going to select it, oops, I hit wireframe there for a moment. I'm going to select it in a way that I could fold this up as an object later. So I'm going to use this face right here as my starting face, and if I select this edge, that edge, that edge, that's my first cut area. And normally I select them all at once, but I'm just going to do it bit by bit here. And so this area here is now going to fold upwards, or if we were looking at it from here, it's going to fold following the path of my mouse here like this, and become flat. And if I do the same to the bottom here, except this time I'm going to go all the way to the other edge, and I'm going to mark that as a cut. Now this will fold down like this, and then the whole thing will fold forward like this. If you can see my mouse here, it's going to fold forward like that. And so now we're going to be left with one long strip. You gotta have to kind of visualize this in your head. And I don't actually have to make any more cuts, because that leaves these two sides here, and they're already, by virtue of sharing faces with the other ones, already marked for a cut. And so they're just going to fold, this guy is going to fold forward like this, this one is going to fold forward like this. And what we're going to end up with is a T shape, and you might have actually seen this before in cubes to put together. They're often in a T shape. So if I do continue, and I did this correctly, yep, now it's rotated it, and I want to fix that. I'm going to right click and I'm going to rotate. Not that it matters, I'm not saving this object anyway, but as you can see, it is a T shape. One other thing I'm going to do really quick is just scale it down. There we go, blah blah blah. It's slightly rotated. Like I said, it doesn't really matter. I'm not keeping this object. But now you can kind of see that, and I'll make it easier to see here. I'm going to create a texture. Now you can see that if this was a flat piece of paper, and you were to cut this shape out, and then fold it along those lines, you could fold this into a cube. Just slap some tape on there, and you have a 3D cube made out of a two-dimensional piece of paper. So that is UV mapping. Now in more complicated objects, this gets really complicated really fast, and that's where the frustration of UV mapping comes in. Often you do this and you expect it to come up onto the screen in a certain way, and instead the program just messes it up and you have to go back and try all over again. And so that's actually what happened with the torch object. It turned out to be an extraordinarily complicated object to map. So what I've done, we're going to scrap this guy now, is I have just loaded up. So just for reference, this was our torch before. And what I've done is I've already gone and mapped it. And this is going to look a bit more complicated than the last one. It actually took me quite a while to do this. But if I go to UV mapping, I'm not going to right click. That'll delete all my work. And middle click would be if I wanted to make any more tweaks, any more cuts. But I'm just going to left click because I've already done all that. And so I'm just going to this page here. So now what I have, and I haven't done anything past this point here of just getting it onto the page here, is I have all the different pieces. And so let's go over these pieces really quickly just by selecting object. This is one of these bars, and then it also just kind of selects certain areas of the ring as well. So all of these, that's what they do. So I'm going to select all those for now, and I'm just going to move them out of the way. We'll just go up there. They kind of look like little rockets or something, don't they? And then these two fellers are just the cylinders unwrapped, and they're the wooden torch pieces. They're going to move off to this side, and in addition, I'm also going to take, where are you here? There's this tiny little piece. This is right at the very bottom here, just that bottom there. I'm going to move that over here as well. Then we have this guy right here, and this is the inside part of the ring and also the inside part of those structures coming up. And we'll just move that over here. I'm just kind of separating all these different objects so that I can sort them through and work on them later, because you may notice that a lot of them are rotated in ways that, you know, aren't good. They're harder to texture when they're rotated that way. They'd be a lot nicer if they were flat. So now we have the front and the back of the back plate. Gonna move that over here. And we're almost done. These two guys are the top and bottom of the holder. Move them down. Oh, they're all over the place, aren't they? Grab you, move you down there. There we go. And then we have this guy, and he is the outside part of that bowl. I rather like this one. I don't really think I have to make any changes to it. It's fine the way it is. And actually the same goes for this feller too. This is the inside part of the bowl, as I can show you right now. And it's actually already fine just the way it is. There isn't really any changes I have to make to that. And I believe all we have left is this bit, and it's just what wraps around the handle. We have the top of the handle, the bottom of the handle, and then this wraps around the side. And I had to do those cut those into 3 parts, just to make it readable. So let's tackle each bit at a time, because most of these aren't in the way you actually want them to end up on the page. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to move things around just a little bit more, and I'm going to sort things into what we're ready to put onto the page and what we're not. So that's already done there. And I'd say this little tiny piece is also done. They're already ready to go into the page. I'm not worried about them. So let's start tackling the rest. And I'm going to start with the handle pieces. I'm going to move those back in for now. And these are pretty close to what I could have them looking like, but I'd rather they be just a square piece. Nothing curved like this. It's not as easy to texture when it's curved like this. So to do that, I'm going to select first the top and bottom edges. Let's see if I can just... Okay. I pressed G there to select similar ones, but it's not... Yeah, I'll just have to select one whole side. And then G, I believe G does the parallel ones. So G now select all the ones beneath it. And I don't think it's selected anything else, so that's perfect. Now, what's interesting is Wings 3D acts a little differently with some of its tools than others. So if I pick rotate here, it's going to rotate the whole thing relative to the origin. However, if you pick scale, it'll scale absolutely. And so if I pick, I believe it's vertical, yep, it's going to do this. And if you notice up there in the corner, when I'm doing this, there's a percentage that's changing. Just right up in the top left corner underneath the open icon. There's that percentage that is changing. And if you remember from last tutorial, if I press tab, I can actually put a value in there. And if I press 0, that's going to flatten everything up. And now all I have to do is do the exact same thing. So once again, I press G to select all the, I believe, parallel ones. And this time I'm just going to choose to scale horizontal, press tab and press 0. And now I have a perfect flat piece. If I copy the exact same thing, I can make this a flat piece as well. Technically, there'd be less warping if I left the bottom to taper in a little bit, but I just find it simpler to work with a flat piece, and it's not going to be noticeable anyway. So once again, I'm going to scale this. I'm going to scale it vertical. I'm going to press 0. Everything flattens down. I'm going to select these edges, and I'm going to scale them horizontal. I'm going to press 0. Now I have 2 flat pieces to work with, and these are done. So I'm going to move these over. Oh, I should have left more room there. I'm going to move these over here, and that is our done pile. So the next we have to deal with this, and this actually really is good almost the way it is. The only thing I really need to do here is rotate this. And actually, while this is on an angle, I can show you sort of how this is reflected in the object itself. Right now, this is on an angle, so all the texture will be shown on it diagonally. And if we go into the inside of this object, you can see all the letters are diagonal. Everything else is, well, actually it isn't right now. A lot of items are straight, but if you go on to this ring here and this part coming up, it's all diagonal. And if this was a texture, most textures, let's say for example wood grain, you don't want that to be showing diagonally. You want wood grain to be showing either vertically or horizontally. So that is why this rotation doesn't really work, unless in the texture editor yourself you went and rotated that wood grain image, and that just creates more complication. So all I have to do is rotate this to be perfectly straight, or as straight as I can make it. Now I can do that like I was just trying there, free, or I can make a guess here, which is that this is probably rotated at 45 degrees. So if I choose rotate, and this time I just press tab, and I'm going to do let's see, -45 would make it straight. See, that looks all right there. And then I want another 90 degrees. So let's see, that's 135 total, I think. -135. And okay, so I wasn't exactly right. It wasn't perfectly at 45 degrees. So much for that. So I will tweak it a bit. Now it's fairly straight. That is done. I'm going to move that over to here. And now we have the back plate. And we'll just knock this out of the park. It's going to be pretty quick. So let's see if this is rotated at 45 degrees. If I do 45, no such luck. Sometimes there is a little trick you can do to rotate this correctly. If I press remap UV on this one object and I just press unfold, okay, so sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it'll unfold it correctly into a square shape. Other times it'll just be stubborn, and I don't really know how to fix that. So that's alright. I will just rotate it manually. And I want to get this one as absolutely straight as possible because of something we're going to do in just a moment here. Actually, let me just move that into here, and I'll use the image as a guideline. I think that's actually, I think that's already pretty straight. Alright, so this front plate and the back of this back plate, not the sides that fold in, but just the back, should be exactly the same. And the texture that I can wrap around them should be the same as well. So there's a couple things I could do. I could stitch this to there, and then I would have one single object, and what that does is that makes the texture wrap nicely around and make it a bit more seamless. However, no one is ever going to notice this back plate, and instead of doing that, I want to actually save texture space. So I'm going to select both of these, and I'm going to pick the option move to the center. And because this front part of the back plate is the same size as the back part of the back plate, if that makes any sense. It's going to fit perfectly inside here and line up perfectly. And from now on I'm going to treat this as one object. I'm going to move that over to here. And the reason I did that was whenever I can do something like that, I usually do, because that saves texture space. So if you want your textures to be fairly large, fairly high resolution, but you also have a lot of shapes, such as here, this is the best way to do it. There's actually another one I'm going to do that to, and I kind of think that I'll just do that right now. All these three, actually. Well, no, this one's wood, so I can't do that. But these two, I'm going to move to center as well. And they can share the same texture space. These won't line up quite as well, but one of these is on the inside of the torch, and the other one doesn't need to line up with these outside bits. And they're also, it's just one of those areas that's not very likely to be noticed. So that's going to be treated as one object. Another thing we're going to treat as one object, or make it share a similar texture space, is these two guys down here. So I'm going to rotate these. There we are. Fairly straight. And then I'm going to rotate this guy 180 degrees. That was just tab I pressed again, just as a reminder. And we'll do the same trick of moving to the center. If we zoom in, those are just about on the dot. I'm actually going to tweak this a little bit. And I'm going to move that there. Okay. I'm going to treat that as one object. That's done. And this guy, to be honest, he can go vertical or horizontal. He's already pretty much done. I could straighten him out a bit like I did with the wood pieces, but he's a pretty small piece, and I don't think that the difference is going to be noticeable enough to matter. So for now, I'm actually going to treat this guy as done. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do is I'm just going to rotate him just the tiniest bit, maybe make him more lined up. I just don't really care what this guy looks like right now. He's not super important, so I'm treating him as done. And all that leaves is these incredibly complicated objects, which are the bars on the outside and match up a little with some of the ring as well. And I actually consider these to be fairly done. There are tweaks I could do, but as long as I rotate them so that they're more vertical and they're all in line with each other, then I'm actually already fairly happy with how they are. The reason they have to be in line with each other is I'm going to use the same trick of rotating to center. So what I'm going to do is I have this blue line here, and I'm going to rotate, I'm going to rotate the first one as straight as I can. Just like that. Let's see how that looks. Good enough. And I'm going to move him to the center. Oh, no, don't want to move you. I'm going to move him to the center. Actually, I could have done this all in one step, but that's okay. And I'm going to move all these guys to the center. And I'm going to move them without rotating them. No, I don't want to do that. Let's try that again. There. Alright, move to center. Okay, I take that back. I cannot decipher that. Let's see. Alright. Let me just move it off to the side here. I'll use this to select one, move him to the center. And because I know he's perfectly in the center, when I rotate, he should line up. Yeah, it's just a matter of lining up the different edges there. It doesn't matter if it's not 100% perfect, as long as it's pretty close. And I'm going to do the same thing several more times. Rotate. Okay. I do not know why he's not lining up as well, but that's good enough. I don't need them to be perfect. In you go. Try it again. Interesting. The center of the object is actually considered differently when rotating. So I have to move it to center more than once to line it up correctly if I want to use the original object as a reference point. I totally knew that this whole time. You discover new things all the time. And that was one of them. There we go. They're matching up well enough. Move to center. And I believe we just have one more. To be honest, they probably could match up even less. It's one of those things where I like it to look fairly decent. It doesn't really matter in the long run, it's just a personal preference of mine. So this is now treated as one object. And now we have all of our objects. This is, all those different objects have been turned into this. And so now that these guys are all back in the page, we can actually scale everything up a bit and start to figure out how we can fit everything in. And let's go like that. Now I'm actually going to move that out again. And then we'll start dragging things in and see what happens. So I want to start with these two. Or this one, I guess it's one object now. And drag him, if I have him off to the side there. And then we'll have this guy over here. So I think we have made everything just a little too big. Yep. Alright, that's fine. I'm going to scale everything down a bit. Back to the corner. Okay. What else do we have to fit in here? Let's get these two up in the top. Just like that. And now that I see what space is available, I'm actually going to move this guy up. This guy will fit in neatly at the bottom. Maybe on this side. There we go. This guy can tuck in right there. Can't forget about this tiny little wood piece. So he's gonna go, I don't know, right there. It doesn't really matter for him. He can go just about anywhere. This guy shall go right there. And then in this space, I should be able to tuck in this guy. And time to make 100% sure nothing's overlapping. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose create texture. Up until this point, this is UV mapping information, telling the object where to put the texture. When I click create texture, it creates an actual texture that you can paint over in another program. And this is going to be a fairly small object. I don't need this to be very high detail, so 1024 by 1024 is going to be more than enough, I believe. If you had something like, say, a large architecture piece, such as the arch that will be coming out in my model pack, then you might want to choose a larger texture. Don't go overboard. Overgrowth will not thank you for that. Or if you had something like, say, a ring, or a very small piece, you could do like a 256 texture, even smaller, because no one's going to notice the lack of detail. In this case, I'm just going to go with the default. Now you can see everything has been traced over and turned into nice white lines, although they're not really white, as we'll see when we go into GIMP. But it's easy to see where everything goes and how everything works. And actually, now that I see that, I'm going to make some tweaks. I'm going to move this guy up a bit, and let's see here. That might actually be all I need to do. I might not have even needed to do that. The reason being is because I'm not going to carefully shape metal texture onto each one of these pieces. I'm going to slap a great big metal texture onto the whole thing to save some time. You know what? It doesn't really hurt for it to be down there. It's all good. So what we're going to end up with, I shall move him over a bit though, is one corner of the texture that is a piece of wood, a wood texture, and then the remaining texture is just going to be the squares of metal that are just slapped onto here. It's a bit of a lazy way of doing it, but it saves me a lot of time, and for an object this small, doesn't really matter. Alright, so I'll create the texture again. Now I can exit out of this. This is actually done. The UV mapping is done, and if you look at the object here, you can see the trace lines where that texture was created, and it's a bit warpy here because we were sharing the top and the bottom. You can see the bottom showing through, but it doesn't matter, that you won't notice because it'll be just a piece of metal. So now all that remains is to save this. Now, when I was doing the modeling, we did everything in quads because I find quads look nicer and they're easier to work with. However, when it goes into Overgrowth, it has to be in triangles. And triangles are going to look like this. Gotta be in face mode here. And actually, while I'm at it, go over one thing I forgot to mention in the last tutorial bit, which is that when you're finished your model, there's a couple things you should always do. The first one is go into object selection mode. You're going to click cleanup. And I've already done that, so no changes will be made, but it'll just delete any abandoned vertices lying around. And the other one, I might have already gone over that in the previous one, I don't remember. The other one is to right click and choose tessellate and quadrangulate. And that will just make sure that your entire mesh is correct. It's made up of quads, that there's no bits that would not work in an object in a game. But I'm actually going to use this to choose triangulate, just to show you what this is going to look like when Overgrowth sees it, when we export it. So it's a bit less readable, a bit harder to work with. But when it gets exported to Overgrowth, this is what it has to look like. It has to be made out of triangles. The nice thing is I don't have to do that in this step. I can leave it like this, leave it easy to work with. I'm going to use this opportunity to save. And then when I go to export, I choose .obj, wavefront, and I just make sure that triangulation is selected. And I think this is default, but if it's on quadrangulation, just bring it back to triangulation. Make sure that you export normals, UV coordinates, all that should be already selected, already the default. And I like PNG. You could probably export it as a TGA if you wanted, or DDS, but PNG I find is easy to work with. I'm going to choose OK. And I am going to export this. And for now, actually, I'm just going to bring this to my desktop so that I can, I'll drag it in later and all that. And that's it. This side of things is completely done. The object is finished. The object is UV textured. And now all that remains is to put an actual image onto it. So we're going to do that real quick. I've already saved, so I can safely exit. And when you export your object, you're going to get a few things. You're going to get the object itself. You're going to get an MTL file, which in Overgrowth's case, I don't believe we actually need, so I'm going to delete that. I haven't found a use for it anyway. And a PNG file, which will be named something like this, or something similar. And this is what you're interested in right now. Usually the first thing I do is rename this so that I don't forget what it is, and I don't forget to rename it when I move it in. So phase and wall torch. And I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to choose open with GNU image manipulation program, or GIMP. So hello, welcome to GIMP. I'm not really going to go through how this works. You don't actually have to do much here. This is going to be pretty simple. I need to find a metal texture, and I need to find a wood texture. And the lovely thing is that I already have a metal and wood texture because I've been working with those earlier. So I just have to find that real quick. Let's see here. Textures. Let's find the wood one first. Wood floor might do. And I'm going to drag that in. That's going to create a new layer. I don't remember if I've changed my layout here. Also, I don't actually want this feller here. But you might see layers here, you might not. Depends on whether I've modified my layout. But in GIMP, unlike Paint or simpler programs, you can have different layers that you can turn on and off, and that'll make it so that you can change different parts of your level, sorry, of your image without making those changes permanent. You can always revert them later by simply disabling the layer. Okay, let's see what else I've got. Let's try. We'll do the smooth wood texture, actually, that Piper sent me. That'll do. That'll do fine. Alright, so I want to scale that down. There's the little scale tool in the left side here. I'm going to pick that, scale it down to something manageable, and I'm going to move it. And I'm just going to park it there, and that part of the texturing is done. I just have to find a metal texture. And I think for the model ones, we're not actually using, we're using the inbuilt metal texture, so I'll go to that. Let's see here. Textures, textures, textures. And just search for metal. I don't remember exactly what it's called or where it is. Oh dear, there might actually be quite a few metal textures in here. Alright, let's actually just have a look. Nice thing is that I've recorded the location of this in here. Buildings, detail textures, gray metal color. So let's go to that. Buildings. We got detail textures, gray metal color. There we go. Alright, I'm going to drag that feller in. I'm not going to do any of that. Overgrowth textures are always transparent. That's how the specular amount is decided, by how transparent it is. So the first thing I'm going to do on this layer is I'm going to select it all with Control A, and then I'm going to hold down Control V to repeatedly paste it over itself. Let go for a second there. Keep going, keep going. Actually, there's probably a faster way to do that, and I have to do this eventually anyway. Layer. I'm going to remove the alpha channel. There we go. Now I have a texture I can work with. I am going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to scale that. Actually, in this case, I can probably just move it. And if you remember what I mentioned earlier, the overgrowth, sorry, wings actually didn't make that perfectly white background. It just made it transparent. So I'm going to add that in really quickly as a reference, just so I can see what I'm doing a little better. And now I'll go back to this layer and drag it over top, just like that. Just to make sure, I'm also going to scale it up just a little, just so it gets everything. Whatever. Scale it like that. Move it back. Alright. And because this is seamless, actually, you know what we'll do? This is seamless, so I'm going to drag it over the whole thing. And then I'm actually just going to cut a bit out of it. So I'm going to move it over. Actually, I don't even have to do that. I can just move it underneath like that. And this is the texture. I do want to change one thing. I want to make this a little darker. I'm envisioning the torch metal as more of a dark corroded metal, I guess. It also is going to help hide the fact that there's seams there. Alright, so I'm going to change the, let's just do the brightness here, see what that does. Yeah. There we go. And then if you remember, well, and actually, here, I'm going to bring this over the top here for just for a second. So you can see now that the entirety of the handle is going to be wood, and the bottom's going to be wood. This is all going to be wood now. Everything that was metal is encased in a metal texture. So even though the texture file itself looks simple, this should do the job. Now remember what I said about the specularity being controlled by how transparent the texture is. Well, we actually need to do that now. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to merge that down. We can delete that now. There's our texture, and I'm just going to make it transparent by sliding the opacity slider here. And I find that if I don't want my texture to be super shiny, 5% works. So there we go. You can actually barely see the thing now, but trust me, the texture is still there. And I'm going to overwrite the original texture. If you want to make sure you haven't made a mistake or something, you can always just save it as a different file so that if you make a mistake, you can go back to the original file. I'm fairly confident this will work. So that's it. Your object is now created and textured. I can't actually show the texture here because it won't show up in Windows 10 model viewer. I can show the object, possibly. There we go. And that texture should wrap around it all and make it look like an actual torch. In the next video, we will cover placing this into the game. And that's fairly short, not going to be as long as this video. It's just creating a couple files and pointing to a couple of other files in them. So I will see you over there.